Thank you all for joining us here today for what promises to be a fantastic discussion on Sri Lanka. My name is Akhil Bery, and I'm the Director of South Asia Initiatives for the Asia Society Policy Institute. Sri Lanka is in the midst of its worst economic crisis since independence, defaulting on its debt obligations for the first time, and there's seemingly no end in sight to the crisis. Protesters fed up with the situation have gathered in large crowds and successfully forced former Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa and the cabinet to resign, and kept pushing their demands until President Gotabaya Rajapaksa fled the country and emailed in his resignation. Prime Minister Damsinghe has taken over as acting president, and Parliament is set to elect a new president tomorrow to carry out the remainder of Rajapaksa's term. Looming over this election is the fact that IMF negotiations are ongoing, which are critical to unlocking further bilateral and multilateral aid. To take stock of the situation and give some insights into what's likely to happen next, I'm joined by three fantastic panelists. First is Bhavani Fonseka, who is a senior researcher and attorney at law with the Center for Policy Alternatives, with a focus on research, national and international advocacy, and public interest litigation. Her work has revolved around assisting victims and affected populations across Sri Lanka, legal and policy reforms, and public interest litigation. Bhavani is also an Asia 21 South Asia Fellow. Next is Chayu Damsinghe, who is the product head at Frontier Research, working primarily with the economics team. He plays a leading role in helping Frontier understand debt crises across the world and tying those into the Sri Lankan situation. He also heads work around understanding COVID-19 pandemic and other black swan risks and tying those into the macroeconomic stories of the country, and takes a key role in the development of Frontier's views on interest rates and the Lankan rupee, and in the presentation of content to Frontier's clients. Finally is Asanga Abeygoonasekara, who is a senior fellow at the Millenium project in Washington, D.C. He has led two government think tanks providing strategic advice on foreign policy and security in Sri Lanka. He was the founding Director General of the National Security Think Tank under the Ministry of Defense until January 2020. Before that, he served as the Executive Director at the Foreign Policy Think Tank Kadir Gamar Institute, and he has also served as a senior researcher for social impact and a fellow alumni of NISA in Washington, D.C. and APCSS in Hawaii. Bhavani, may I start with you to talk a little bit about the political situation, what to expect tomorrow, and how you see the events from tomorrow afterwards unfolding?
Thanks, Akhil, and thank you, Asia Society, for having this. And it's good to be back with the Asia Society family. And it's a very timely discussion. I mean, things are very, very dynamic in Sri Lanka. Today, we found out that there are three names in terms of the nominations for the elections tomorrow that will be held in Parliament. So the parliamentarians will decide who's going to be elected president in Sri Lanka. And as Akhil mentioned, that will be for the remainder of the term of Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Now, just stepping back to understand what it all means, this the crisis, really, there's a political and economic crisis, and hopefully we have time to go into some of the key issues, has led to massive protests in Sri Lanka. I mean, Sri Lanka has a history of protests and citizen mobilization, but what we've seen in the last few months, since March this year, is really quite remarkable. It started as citizens just starting the protests in suburbs and just coming out in protest of the economic hardships from long power cuts. I'm facing a power cut as I speak to you, so apologies if there's a technical glitch, but power cuts have become the new norm now. Finding essential items is extremely difficult. Long queues, which is a common sight now in every corner. Long queues to get fuel is also one of those becoming quite the norm in Sri Lanka, as well as increasing cost of living and inflation. So there's a combination of economic factors that led to this frustration, anger among citizens, which led to these protests. And the protests that have been seen in the last few months have spread across Sri Lanka. So it's not in just one place. What is also quite remarkable is the numbers just increased. People were just not satisfied with the answers given by the government. And despite various tactics imposed by the president and the then government, including curfew, declaration of state of emergency, and I want to say we are now in the third state of emergency in Sri Lanka for this year. We've had two before. And declaration of emergency largely introduced to prevent people from coming out to the streets, and it's preventing dissent. So there were different tactics used, from curfew to emergency to attempts to get court orders, various tactics used. But despite all of that, what was remarkable is that the numbers just grew. And on the 9th of July, we saw, and I'm really moving very quickly because we don't have a lot of time. What happened on the 9th of July was hundreds and thousands of people came to the streets, came to Colombo, but other areas as well. Many walked for hours because of the fuel crisis. We were not able to travel by vehicle. And what happened is the massive numbers resulted in them breaching the official residence of the president as well as the presidential secretariat, subsequently the official residence of the prime minister. All of this, I'm just raising this because this marked the promise by the then president to resign. This is Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was extremely powerful and obtained a lot of powers because of a particular constitutional amendment passed under his presidency in 2020. This one individual who held the office of the executive presidency had to promise he would resign. But that resignation took some time, which created further uncertainty, contributed to further anger among people because they felt this was dragging on. The Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe, too, agreed he would resign, but is now the acting president in Sri Lanka. Now, there's a lot of names, a lot of changes. I apologize if this is leading to further confusion. It is rather confusing for all of us as well. But we now have the Prime Minister, who also acts as the president, who also acts as a finance minister, and there are legal constitutional issues around this, who has now indicated he is going to contest elections tomorrow. So what is going to happen is we have elections that hopefully in a couple of hours, by Wednesday morning, by noontime Wednesday in Sri Lanka, we hopefully will know who is going to be our next president, who will serve the term up to 2024. That is the term of the presidency. But this is in a context of massive turmoil in Sri Lanka. Politically, and I just want to speak to the politics here, politically, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's demand. The protesters have demand for a system change, and a system change that includes abolishing of the executive presidency. They have actually obtained some of their demands: the resignation of the president, the resignation of the former prime minister, who's also the elder brother of the former president, the Rajapaksas. So they've obtained some results, but their main demand is a system change. And that includes specific reforms that are required. Abolishing the executive presidency is one, addressing corruption, ensuring there are checks and balances. There's a whole gamut that hopefully we could go into detail if there's interest. But I just want to end with this note that while there's a lot of uncertainty and political uncertainty, what has happened in the last few months has also opened up spaces. There is open criticism, debate in Sri Lanka. There's quite remarkable energy in terms of people feeling after several years of repression and authoritarian governance that there is now some hope. So there is quite some energy on the ground. But what happens from tomorrow onwards is going to be critical, whether we are able to obtain that stability to start the economic recovery and ensure that Sri Lanka moves forward. So I'll end here and happy to take on questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bhavani. That was a fantastic overview. Chayu, let me just jump onto that last point about the political stability, because that I saw a press conference by Kristalina Georgieva where she mentioned that political stability is kind of needed for the IMF negotiations to continue. And of course, these discussions are happening at the technical level, but ultimately it'll need some political commitments. How do you kind of see the negotiations with the IMF proceeding? What are kind of the demands you think they would want to see, and how likely do you think it is that Sri Lanka is going to, and what kind of comes after the IMF program, I would say?
Right. Thanks, Akhil, and thanks for having us here on this program as well. So I think that leads into a very important question, and kind of almost what I feel is a bit of a misunderstanding in the way the narrative around the IMF can take, in that what's both in terms of the political stability point of it, and as well as the kind of conditions that come along with. Now, as you rightly mentioned, sorry, as you rightly mentioned, what the IMF would be looking at right now, instead of specifically political stability itself being the core feature, but rather that political commitment to some sort of policy measure. So Sri Lanka's debt being considered unsustainable means that some of the requirements are primarily both on the debt restructuring side that has to happen concurrently, but also on the budget side, fiscal reform in terms of tax increases, limiting increase in additional spending, and measures along those sides. So there needs to be political commitment, legislative commitment to further those goals. That can happen both in terms of, for example, an interim budget being passed, different legislative reform required for taxation, for example. And political stability matters to the IMF only insofar much as it gets those goals across. So I think there is a narrative, especially building among Sri Lanka, given, of course, that this is, like Bhavani mentioned as well, very much a political question now popping up as well, and everyone's individual political beliefs are tying into this. That the IMF requires a certain type of political stability, or this government is better versus that government, that arrangement is the most stable, and therefore what the IMF wants. I think that misunderstands what exactly the IMF's role here is. What the IMF wants is some sort of arrangement that gets across these policy reforms, and they can explicitly say, look, there is a commitment that this country has made to continuing on with these policy reforms, even if there is some sort of uncertainty in the stability of whatever coalitions are there in parliament. So I think policy consistency and parliamentary stability do have to be taken somewhat separately, of course, very much linked. And that ties into other examples that we've seen in other countries as well. You can have different changes in parliament, changes in prime ministers, presidents, and all. During crises like these, you often see those changes. But when you have some sort of consensus among parties, consensus among at least leading parties and leading parliamentarians, that this specific pathway is the one we're going on, then as long as you have some sort of enough stability, some arrangement in parliament that allows those reforms to come through, that really does then serve as an important point. Now, then the question is what those kinds of reforms are, and how those the conditionality associated with those reforms, will they really get implemented? What kind of barriers are there towards that? And that once again gets, I think, thinking of these as IMF conditions for a package, I think kind of mixes up the reality of how that process, that negotiation works. I prefer to think of it, and I prefer to understand it in the context of you have a country like Sri Lanka, which has taken certain policy actions that has gotten it to all these shortages, this massive economic crisis that the country is facing. So anyone, the IMF or any bilateral, any multilateral institution, if they are to support this country financially, what guarantee do they have that the country is not going to go down that same policy direction, and then basically lead to all that money, all that financial, legal, international support essentially being thrown down the drain? So how I think it's useful to understand the conditions that come along with the IMF are, is there enough being taken to reverse the trajectory of the policies that took the country down to this point? For Sri Lanka's case, it's very much in terms of pretty atrocious taxation policy that took a country with already fragile taxation structures and made it far worse, probably one of the worst in the world. You're talking about that side of things. You're talking about consistent increase in state sector employment, while the expenditure side for Sri Lanka might not be as much of a problem. the fact that, it's been a consistent increase is worrying. So you do need to kind of, especially in the absence of tax revenue, these are things you need to look at. You have problems with our government-owned companies that are making massive losses, massive debt issues. So are you doing things to reverse those policies? Are you reversing the trillions of rupees that were just injected into the system to meet the budget deficit? So are these the kinds of things are you going to reverse? So with the IMF policy, and also given that Sri Lanka's economy has come to this level, and it's easy to think of Sri Lanka's economy as having functionally zero reserves. It's very much about, are you going to implement these reforms? And if you do, well, we can give you money, we can give you support. But if you don't implement these reforms, well, there's nothing we can do. And that's, I think, the kind of way that international engagement with Sri Lanka is going to work around right now, especially when you look at these multilateral organizations. Of course, the question is, how soon are those reforms going to come into place? For example, the interim budget was originally supposed to be in April. Then you said May, June, July, August. Now it's supposed to be in August. Now we don't know whether this new political arrangement will get that quicker, whether it'll be even more delayed. So there are questions. How soon are these reforms going to come in? And does the public situation allow for some of these reforms? Because these are, of course, painful reforms. And do we have a government or governance structure that is able to tell the people, look, these are the reforms we're going to take. Yes, they are going to be difficult in the short term, but trust us, we are not those guys. This time, it will result in some sort of benefit, not too far away into the future. Do we have a system, a governance structure that can tell that convincingly to its people? So the negotiations also, will continue. Like I said, the technical discussions are continuing on like the specific tax proposals that needs to come in and the like. What's really being a sticking point, and what will remain to be a sticking point, unless Parliament really, frankly, gets its act together, is, are those things actually being implemented through law in Parliament? If they are, you can move on with the negotiations, get ahead with the process much faster. But if you don't, then you're going to be stuck. And I think whether that happens or not doesn't necessarily depend on any specific party, but just rather an overall commitment across Parliament to push those reforms through.
Excellent, thank you. Asanga, let me turn to you very quickly. One of the key issues, one of the dynamics we've seen playing out with kind of the current crisis is India has stepped in to help Sri Lanka in a way that maybe you haven't seen before, whereas China, who is assumed to kind of be the best, really close friends with the Rajapaksas, has been willing to extend some humanitarian assistance, but hasn't been willing to offer the debt relief, the debt restructuring relief that kind of Sri Lanka needs. Can you kind of walk us through Sri Lanka's foreign policy, how you see it now, and maybe a little bit of a crystal ball about where you see Sri Lanka's relations with India, China, and even the US heading after this?
Thank you, Akhil. I would like to thank the Asia Society for the invitation. It's a timely discussion. So I think the Sri Lankan foreign policy clearly was tilted towards China during the Rajapaksa regime. One of the clear examples I can give is the foreign secretary speaking in behalf of Xinjiang human rights. First time we had a foreign secretary speaking on behalf of China's human rights concern. Then you had China's CCP and SLPP working together basically to alter the existing political model, which is a dangerous trajectory that the two parties took, which I have sort of highlighted in my writings. So I think with that, there was multiple projects that was basically cancelled or that was being rejected, such as the East Container Terminal swapping to the West Container Terminal. Then you had the Millenium Challenge Corporation, where Gotabaya's expert panel, which he appointed, mentioned that there's a national security threat. Then the Japanese LRT basically saying that they're canceling the project. So all of these, most of the Western projects were affected, as well as the Indian projects. So what you see is, from this crisis, you see India sort of coming back into the foreign policy picture from the assistance, the 3.5 billion that has been given, and India playing a larger role in Sri Lanka. A rebalance will be sort of the first thing that the new foreign minister, as well as the foreign ministry, would have to work on. So I think the the external factors need to be calculated here. Basically, what's going on, the geopolitical factors such as the Easter Sunday was one of the serious issues that we had, and affecting the terrorism in Sri Lanka. Then comes the COVID pandemic, which impacted the tourism industry, and Russia's basically the war in Ukraine. Not only the MENA region, but also Sri Lanka had a serious impact from the Ukraine crisis, and especially on the commodity prices and also on the fuel prices. So you see that if the Eurozone crisis continues, the recessions in Europe, Sri Lanka will have a serious impact on its tourism industry as well as its export industry. So the China factor here, the recalibration is really, really important because of the larger geostrategic competition in the Indian Ocean. And this is something that I think the Sri Lanka would need to the foreign policy would need to you need to rebalance it and look into bringing in a rules-based order back again and our commitment towards a rules-based order. And I call it that we are an island sandwich between Indo-Pacific as well as the BRI. So you need a balanced approach to this. And whatever the balance that we lost from the Rajapaksa regime, we need to bring it back. So China has also mentioned about, assisting on the debt restructuring. The foreign ministry spokesperson has mentioned a few days ago about that. So that's a positive sign. So I think China, India, and all other countries should assist Sri Lanka at this juncture. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Asanga. Bhavani, let me turn back to you very quickly, because you mentioned that protesters are looking for political change and a system change, including abolishing the executive presidency. Could you talk a little bit more about the reforms that the Rajapaksas introduced that strengthen the executive presidency, and also what kind of the agreement between the political parties is now and how you see that playing out?
Okay, so that's an important question. I'll try to be as brief as possible. The demand for abolishing the executive presidency has been there for some time. This is not something new. Many of us have been calling for it, considering the all-powerful office and the potential for abuse, and the way it was abused in the past as well, in terms of arbitrary practices. I mean, even this imposing a state of emergency, the president can do it without any check for 14 days, and that is quite worrying. But what has happened is, in the last 2.5 years, people have also seen this all-encompassing office in the hands of an individual who may be able to abuse the office, leads to devastation, leads to this kind of crisis. So it's because people are seeing the direct impact of the office, of decisions being made by one individual, ignoring experts, ignoring parliament or weakening parliament. I mean, there's several examples one can think about where the executive president, just made unilateral decisions. That has really now fueled this demand and this call to reform the political structures. One is the abolishing of the executive presidency. So there's been several bills now presented in Parliament. One is a private member's bill by the main opposition party called the 21st Amendment. It's a bill. And there's a government bill which was approved by Cabinet, which is called the 22nd Amendment. One is trying to abolish the executive presidency. That's the private member's bill. The government bill is trying to diminish certain powers, but as a lawyer, as a critic, I will say the government's bill is insufficient considering the present calls and the present demands and the present crisis. So really we need to look at this moment, and I mentioned this unprecedented moment where we should do everything to push all the reforms we can, and that includes abolishing the executive presidency.
Thank you. Chayu, I just wanted to pick up on something Asanga said, where he mentioned about the Eurozone recession and that having an impact on Sri Lanka's tourism industry. Now, Sri Lanka, of course, is reliant on tourism for foreign exchange. Could you talk a little bit about kind of how we got into this situation where Sri Lanka went from having exports be about 40% of GDP to 20% of GDP, and being heavily reliant on kind of remittances and tourism to bolster its foreign exchange?
Right. Thanks, Akhil. So Sri Lanka's economic woes really, I mean, the underlying factors behind it have been around since independence. I mean, there was a short period, I think a few years in the 1950s, where things started to take a turn for the better, but then ever since that reversed, Sri Lanka's economic situation hasn't really been that well. And that's been that we've consistently had a shortfall in our budget, where Sri Lanka's government revenue has always been lower than our expenses. Not the other way around, to be clear. It's not that our expenses are so high and our revenue can't reach up to it. It's just that our revenue keeps getting lower and lower and lower, and expenditure cannot be met. And then on the other side, on the foreign exchange side, we've essentially always had, again, except for a few instances here and there, a current account deficit, which is very much fueled by Sri Lanka having a very consumption-driven economy, which pushes more and more imports, both in terms of direct import consumption, let's say the fuel for our vehicles, but also indirect. Even, for example, the rice we grow in Sri Lanka to eat, fertilizer, pesticides, all significant components, all of these are really imported. So that structure of the Sri Lankan economy has made it fragile for, decades. Until I think about the earlier part of this century, Sri Lanka, being a lower income country, was able to access pretty concessional financing, and we generally had a higher inflation pathway, which kept Sri Lanka's debt metrics and all basically contained. But since the start of this century, both of those factors changed. The fact that Sri Lanka moved from being a lower income country to a lower middle income country, which meant that we could no longer get a lot of concessional financing, concessional debt, and we had to instead go for commercial debt. And also that our inflation started to get more and more under control, which allowed interest rates and the debt burden on the local debt side also to rise. Now, the combination of those factors essentially meant that Sri Lanka was unable to focus any bit of its resources on export-led development and growth, and had to keep moving resources into essentially meeting those two deficits, and then meeting the debt burden that came off as a result of trying to meet those deficits through debt. Tourism was something that was really picking up and was supposed to be something that really helped Sri Lanka come out of this crisis. By in 2018, the official number is about $5 billion annually in tourism revenue. There are questions about how much of that is realistic. I prefer to think of it like a 3 to 4 billion number instead. But as a result of the pandemic and as a result of everything that's come ever since then in terms of like fuel shortages, our tourism revenue has essentially been hovering around the $0 mark. So moving forward, then the recovery of tourism, especially next year, I think that recovery will be quite significantly, or a significant factor that helps Sri Lanka recover from where we are, and it will be a big part of it. But for that to happen, you still need the shortages on the ground, the political uncertainty, the social unrest to kind of all of those to kind of peter off as well. And until that happens, those tourism itself won't recover. Now, tourism alone won't be enough to help the country because you still have that consumption-driven problem in Sri Lanka. And unless Sri Lanka takes policy actions that takes an economy and turns it from a consumption-driven economy to a more savings-driven economy. And I don't mean like personal savings, but like the economy overall generating enough savings that it can then use for any sort of investment into its own exports, into its own growth, rather than depending on more and more debt and allowing, on the meantime, more and more debt to build up on the consumption side. Sri Lanka's problem will continue. It's very possible for Sri Lanka's problem, even if we get out of it right now, 3, 4, 5 years down the line, to resurface. So those policy reforms to change the underlying structure of the Sri Lankan economy will be absolutely critical to get Sri Lanka out of this crisis. In the short term, of course, there can be things that can, move the dial one way or the other. A recession, for example, might actually lower the price of oil, reducing our import bill in the short term, might ease off some of the shortages. On the flip side, it affects our exports, which have been relatively resilient. Remittances have anyway been quite weak. There's some sense there might be a recovery. So the short term, lots of things that can move things here and there. But for the medium to longer term recovery trajectory, those policy reforms are absolutely critical. Without them, Sri Lanka will very well be back here, in a few years.
Awesome, thank you. And this kind of next question is for both you and Asanga. Asanga, you talked a little bit about kind of China's role here, and one of the narratives here is that you often see in the Western press is that Sri Lanka is stuck in a Chinese debt trap. Could you shed some light on why that argument is here and whether or not that is the case?
Well, clearly, Sri Lanka is in a debt trap. I have been saying this for the last several years. The reason was because of the lack of transparency, as well as the high interest rates that we've been borrowing. And we have been not looking at the strategic side, which China was trying to plant in Sri Lanka, the duality of the military and the civil, the nexus that they were trying to establish in the island. So unfortunately, general public has not seen agreements such as the 99-year agreement, that was signed, as well as the many sort of project. If you look at Hambantota, some of the loans were taken at 6.4%. So the people who are debunking the debt trap theory actually has not seen these agreements. So they were debunking on assumptions. So that's why I mentioned in my paper in Sweden clearly that there is a, let's look at it something beyond the debt trap, a strategic trap in the island. It's clearly happening. So why I mentioned strategic trap is because of three attributes. One is the CCP maneuvers in the political space, political funding, as well as maneuvering in the political model. The second is on the human rights, which Sri Lanka it will be difficult for Sri Lankan, even the future regimes, to get out of that, where the support of China, as well as Sri Lankan regime reciprocally supporting China. The third is on the military level. Basically, you have the defense understandings, as well as the agreements and the support that has been given. So those three attributes are really high, and they're playing really high in the Sri Lankan foreign policy. It has been accepted by the Rajapaksas and sort of taken so forward. One of the most difficult issues that the Ranil Wickremesinghe had during the 2015 and the 2019 regime, I can share one particular incident. When I was in Davos with Mr. Wickremesinghe and his delegation, the Chinese followed him there, even to Davos. So there was a delegation there, and Wickremesinghe said, and why are these people here also in Davos? And do I have to sort of keep, defending this situation? Because he said that he would investigate the Chinese projects at that time and would look into, basically if there were deals done, or if there was, some sort of allegations on the Chinese projects, such as in the Hambantota, as well as various others. So he was going to go one by one, but he couldn't because of the largeness, as well as the influence that Chinese had. And that was very clear during that, the Wickremesinghe and Sirisena regime. So I think the situation of the debt trap, the strategic trap, is installed in Sri Lanka. The signaling that goes from Colombo to Delhi in this basically what's happening in Sri Lanka is a concern for New Delhi and its immediate sphere of influence. So it's something that Sri Lanka foreign policy, as well as the foreign ministry, should take it very seriously about their Chinese strategic trap that has been established in the country.
So sorry, go ahead, Chair.
Yeah, to clarify that and just add an additional point on that, of course, I'm not going to make a comment on the strategic side of things. I think that's Asanga's area of expertise, nothing that I can add or contribute to that discussion. But in terms of the debt itself, and if you look at the total amount of debt and the real crisis of debt that Sri Lanka is in, I think it would not be accurate to say that it's primarily Chinese driven, or that Chinese debt is the reason Sri Lanka is in this kind of crisis. And I think that narrative taking up and taking space doesn't really do justice to the actual problems in Sri Lanka. It's not that if China had never given us debt, Sri Lanka would not have a crisis. I think Sri Lanka would still very much have had a crisis because of the other underlying factors of the economy. Chinese debt officially is about 10% of our total debt. I think if you include project-related debt, it jumps up to about 20%. But still, it's nowhere near the total number of debt. I think a single largest source of debt is international commercial debt, so sovereign bonds and the like. And then you have multilateral debt that also comprises a significant part. I think China does count as the single largest bilateral lender. But that outside of that, it's not necessarily the single largest source of Sri Lanka's debt problems. I think that narrative is not necessarily reflected in the data. And even, for example, on Hambantota report, I think there was this article in the New York Times as well some time ago that essentially Sri Lanka couldn't pay back that debt, so it had to give that port over to China, kind of a debt for equity swap kind of deal, which was not really what happened with Hambantota. It's just that Sri Lanka was facing a similar foreign exchange crisis at that point, and it chose to lease that off to China in order to get some sort of financing at the point. Sri Lanka is still servicing the debt for Hambantota. It's like that debt was not written off or cancelled or reduced in any way. It's just a very different arrangement that happened. So Chinese debt, there are significant concerns, I think, like Asanga said, in terms of accountability, transparency, corruption issues. Then there's also the fact that there's a lot of infrastructure-led development that was pushed through that side, and whether that was really what was necessary for Sri Lanka. But the overall crux of Sri Lanka's debt issues, I don't think it's accurate to say it's primarily Chinese-driven.
Akhil, if I may add to that. Yeah, so what Sri Lanka, what he mentioned was absolutely correct. On what Sri Lanka requires is some sort of toolkit to improve the processes. On one particular project I have studied very carefully, the Matala airport. Now, basically, the Auditor General's report, what has happened, so what it requires is actually a toolkit to improve, is starting from the initial stage of the project. The EIAs were completely ignored, according to the Auditor General. They have not looked at. So that's why you have more than, you have to chase elephants that's coming in, the wild elephants that's coming in. That's why the airport is not functioning. You have borrowed heavily. Then again, the business model, it's not sustainable. So I think Sri Lanka requires, the new government that's coming in requires toolkits to improve the processes.
So let me pick up on that a little bit. And Bhavani, I'd like your input on this. So Asanga also mentioned human rights, and kind of this idea of this Chinese debt trap has really pervaded kind of the thought process here in the US. You see it in articles everywhere. You see it from letters from senators, etc. But one of the other angles is that the US-Sri Lanka relationship has primarily been focused on US advocacy for human rights in Sri Lanka. Do you see kind of this crisis exacerbating tensions between the Sinhalese majority and ethnic minority communities, or how do you kind of see that playing out?
In terms of what's happening now?
Yes, like could the economic crisis exacerbate tensions between kind of the majority and the minority?
I mean, I think it's too early to say. We haven't seen that kind of tensions at the moment. If anything, communities have come together to some extent in terms of the protests, in terms of standing together, but there's also apprehension among many of the minorities, specifically those in the north and victims of the war, that the suspicion that the South never really stood with them during the difficult years. But I just want to also raise this issue in terms of the advocacy the role of the US and others around the HRC, the Human Rights Council session. There is a resolution on Sri Lanka which comes up for discussion in September. So this is going to be an interesting time to see how things play out in the next few weeks in Sri Lanka and how it plays out internationally. Now, in that, US has been one of the big proponents. It was a champion when the first resolution and subsequent resolutions passed. And China has been very much a friend of the government and defending the government, saying this is a domestic issue, it shouldn't be looked at internationally. So I think it will be also interesting to see how that plays out, considering the present crisis, and whether any government, whoever takes office tomorrow, how they also interact with such initiatives, because that could create potential divisions within communities where the minorities feel there has to be a real reckoning as to what happened during the war, whereas many in the South and the majority community feel it's an economic crisis, one needs to address the economic dimension. So it could be that the divisions play out into the future and as to what direction the government and others take into the future.
So let me just pick up also on kind of your comment about the next government and just bringing it back to the current political crisis. Do you see kind of the protesters accepting whoever is president next, or do you see them kind of demanding fresh elections and having a government that's more representative of their demands?
Do you want me to come in? Or?
Yes, please.
So, I don't think any of the candidates garnered the full confidence of the public, not just the protesters, because what we've seen since the nominations and names, the three names, there's a lot of criticism from different actors. So I don't think any one individual at this moment is going to get a resounding support from the public. It's as polarized as that in Sri Lanka. But there has been a clear demand with the resignation of Gotabaya. One of the clear demands has been also the resignation of Ranil Wickremesinghe. The Gota Go Gama, which is this epicenter of the protests in Colombo, turned into Ranil Go Gama after the resignation of Gotabaya, because they said, well, we've got one out, but we want the other one out as well. So that demand is very much there. They don't think Ranil Wickremesinghe has the legitimacy to lead Sri Lanka. And I don't think there's much trust in his leadership. So if he becomes the president tomorrow, there'll be, I don't think many problems will be solved. People will continue to protest. And there could be further uncertainty and instability. Now, if the other two candidates, there are two other candidates coming, they've been engaging with the protesters, they've had meetings, so we'll have to see what kind of engagement happens. There's also discussion that those who've been very involved in the protests play a bigger role in terms of consultation and engaging on policy discussions. These are all conversations. We don't know how things will play out. But one of the clear things that's come out in the last few months is the need for a general election, that the present elected representatives do not enjoy the trust, confidence of the people. There needs to be a fresh mandate. We cannot hold elections right now, and the economic dimension, the ground situation is not conducive. But in the next few months, one needs to think about when one can have the election. So I think we really need to think about elections either later or early this year. That will be something that needs to be looked into.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on something you said, and this is for Chayu and Asanga. So the resolution at the UN Human Rights Council, this could have an impact on, for example, Sri Lanka's relations with the EU, which is reviewing Sri Lanka's participation in the GSP Plus program, which could have an impact on Sri Lanka textile exports from Sri Lanka enjoying duty-free access. Chayu, could you talk a little bit more about Sri Lanka's exports, textiles, et cetera, in Asanga? I'd like you to speak a little bit about Sri Lanka's relations with the EU, and maybe also how the US, the EU can work together to kind of help out Sri Lanka.
Sure. Sri Lanka's exports, like I said, I think the primary export that we deal with Europe would be in terms of textiles and finished textile products. So I think for this year, the expectation is that we would reach somewhere in the vicinity of 4 to 5 billion, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember, those numbers have changed around with the crisis and all. So a big factor that, like, for example, losing GSP Plus would be not only on those, but also on more up and coming exports. I think Sri Lanka had a certain amount of seafood exports that was starting to gain traction and bringing in more revenue. That was, shifting towards the EU. We would had some, not the raw tea sales themselves, but rather finished tea products and other agriculture, value-added agricultural products that are also starting. We start to get new markets into the European Union and the US. So losing GSP Plus access would very much affect those. I think this was some time ago. I think when we first started hearing of this was sometime in 2018 or 19, or around this cycle as well, because when this was when Sri Lanka was moving out and upgrading into an upper middle income country, which would also have meant a similar removal or reduction of some of those GSP Plus benefits, and started looking at some numbers, I remember. And the biggest impact would have been, as I recall, onto the expansion of our export. There would be a short-term, shock to our exports, if that happened. But as I recall, that shock wouldn't be very large. What would really affect it would be the growth trajectory of our exports, where, there might be an expectation, can exports grow 5%, 10% for an extended period of time? That trajectory would have been significantly changed if we lost access or gotten reduced access to European markets. So that was, I think, something that's very much a risk factor. I have nothing, no insight on how those discussions and how that process has gone on since the crisis developed.
Basically, on the EU factor is really, like I mentioned, the Eurozone recession will have a serious impact to Sri Lanka on tourism as well as the export sector in the coming months. European EU, if you look at the relationship between Sri Lanka, when the Indo-Pacific strategy was released, I gave some consultation to the European Union. And they looked at basically what are the country-specific commitments that Sri Lanka has towards a policy document like that. And EU was ready to assist, but the problem was Gotabaya Rajapaksa's regime was heavily autocratic. They rejected basically. They couldn't sort of discuss any sort of even the human rights concerns. So it was irrational decisions that the Rajapaksa regime took. Defending, trying to weaponize their political agenda, the ultra-nationalist agenda, saying that the human rights, they're rejecting all of the recommendations, as well as the Prevention of Terrorism Act was a serious concern for European Union EU ambassadors, which is happening in Sri Lanka, the arbitrary detention, the arrests that was going on. And so these are the serious concerns that affected the EU relationship with Sri Lanka. But I think since the regime is over of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, whoever the next regime should try to sort of develop the relationship with the European Union and the country-specific commitments towards the Indo-Pacific. That is well sort of, the other nations, such as, many other East Asian countries has sort of given a lot of commitments, and Sri Lanka can actually commit because of its past role in the Indian Ocean. One particular project I want to highlight is the Crimario project, which is for the maritime security, which the European Union has in the Western Indian Ocean, which Sri Lanka was discussing. But then again, those technologies should come into the Coast Guards, the naval assistance, And Sri Lanka requires that because you have so much of instability in the country that is not being seen by because of the political economic crisis. Underneath that, arms trade that's going on, the drug trade that's going on. So a lot of insecurity that is there in the country. So that's been seen by New Delhi clearly, as well as the countries that have these technical expertise to look at. So I think Sri Lanka needs this, and European Union can help to sort of assist an island nation like Sri Lanka to build its coastal defense protection as well as the maritime protection, and country-specific, like I said, commitment from Sri Lanka should go towards the European Union.
So we have a question for the audience, from the audience for all the panelists. So the question is, what is your outlook that Sri Lanka remains in a long-term spiral of instability? If the new government cannot deliver results quickly, what are the odds of constant changes of government? The painful conditions for a debt bailout usually aren't popular, not to mention capital flight and brain drain. So this is for everyone or whoever wants to take it.
I'll have to take the economic side of it in terms of what we've seen. And I mean, from what I've seen in other countries as well, it's not very likely for a very prolonged period of instability. I'm talking multiple years of instability. I think in recent years, I think the most or the longest we've seen is been in Lebanon's case, which is about roughly, let's say, a 2-year period where until some sort of resolution came or some sort of, at least a temporary interim resolution started to kind of get itself placed. Now, for Sri Lanka, I think there is definitely a risk of continuous changes in government. I think Bhavani previously talked about, what would happen if protesters especially do not accept whatever solution comes across, and will that lead to further resolution of further changes down the line? I think an election coming in, like she said, is far more likely than an extended period of instability. I think there will be more pressure towards that if the situation seems to be untenable. In terms of a debt bailout, and that's something somewhat interesting that we've seen in Sri Lanka, is that the fact that the Rajapaksa government, the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government, very much took Sri Lanka, through policy, and people very much viewed them as having taken bad policies that took the country down to the situation. In addition to, of course, all the questions about corruption, did mean that there was some point, I remember in March, April, even May, that there were in fact pro-IMF protests happening in Sri Lanka, which seemed, it's not something I ever heard about in any other country happening. So, I mean, and even recently I saw some of the more, of course, there's a vast ideological spectrum represented at the protests, but I've seen, even senior, more, core members of some of these protests talking about how the government need to expedite the IMF process and, of course, have protections along the way. So I don't necessarily know that in the context of a lot of the pain Sri Lanka is going through right now, being tied specifically to the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration and that regime, whether there's going to be a lot of anti-IMF protests moving forward, for example. But the question, and especially since a lot of the pain has already happened, and most of the the more unpopular decisions, except perhaps the electricity rate hike, has already kind of come through. Tax increases are most likely going to vastly disproportionately affect the wealthy because of the requirement to actually raise a lot of revenue. So then the question is there space, or is there a requirement for a lot of economic protests to come up? I'm not necessarily convinced, unless of course things take a turn again for the worse and all the economic situation gets even worse. I think it's more likely than not that we'll come out of it, but I'm sure that others can also kind of add into this.
May I?
Go ahead, Asanga.
I think the instability will continue as long as you have the trust deficit between the parliament as well as the protesters. So you see it widening because of backdoor dealings that they call it political games. The protesters say stop political games, such as a person who has one seat in the parliament coming in as the prime minister. Again, that seat was given as a bonus seat. It was not elected from the people. So stop dealings and all that. So I think the political deals or the backdoor, political deals has to stop the trust deficit has to be established, because here is a parliament created by the Rajapaksas. I mean, the majoritarian rule of the SLPP, and that what has happened is their mandate is no more in a sense of a realist. If you look at it in the perspective, although they say they have the mandate in the parliament, but the protesters have sort of seen that they have. I mean, the popular demand of the protesters as well as the parliamentarians, there is a gap. So I think that gap needs to be bridged. So one of the contestants for the presidential now, which is Sajith Premadasa and Dallas, who mentioned, I was just looking at the statements, they mentioned that we are declaring a consensus day, a very important sort of signaling towards the protesters. So consensus should be built among the political parties. And that's the way forward, I think, because here, whatever the next ministers, we had 3 cabinets for 2 months. The 4th one will be appointed soon. So whoever you appoint, they will reject. So some sort of consensus would help.
Excellent. Bhavani, do you have anything to add? Otherwise, I can go to one more question.
Why don't we go? Because I think they covered most of the main issues, yeah.
So one last question from me. Bhavani, I'm going to give you a hard one, and then also I'm going to ask everyone to do like kind of 6 months out, looking into the crystal ball, what do the next 6 months look like? But one question for you, Bhavani, is that we've seen the Rajapaksas fall from power before and make a stunning comeback. How likely do you think it is that that could happen again? And then again, also, what do the next 6 months look like?
That's a very important question, Akhil, because Rajapaksas are very, very influential in Sri Lanka. I mean, it's a very powerful family rule. I mean, they've had a spectacular fall in the last few months from both the president and the former president and the former prime minister resigning, others in government, the Rajapaksas resigning. But they have their party, the SLPP, has the highest number of seats in parliament. And now it's going to be interesting to see how things play out tomorrow, because part of the party supports Ranil Wickremesinghe, the other group supports Dallas Perumal's candidacy. So we'll have to see how that plays out tomorrow. But regardless, their party has the majority of seats. So they are going to influence the legislative agenda. And at this moment, for the executive arm to push things through, they will have to rely on Parliament to get key reforms through. So you will have them influencing at different levels. I'm not ruling out their comeback. I think, as you quite rightly said, 2015, the electoral defeat. And that electoral defeat saw the creation of this party. And they have gone from strength to strength till this year. So they are a force to be reckoned with. They may be in the back foot right now, but they are a force to be reckoned with. And we'll have to see what kind of avatar they take. In terms of the 6 months, I think it's going to be difficult times ahead. I mean, it's been difficult this year. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be uncertain. But if the correct leadership comes together, and whoever is elected tomorrow needs to recognize it's not one party rule. It has to be a coalition. There has to be consensus, but also very clear timelines. This is going to be a temporary measure, communicate to the people, elections at a particular time period. One of the big grievances of the public is that it's a very elite-driven, top-down approach of governance in Sri Lanka. This has to change. So whoever takes it on needs to ensure that those demands are met. But I'm cautiously optimistic that we can start that recovery process and the rebuilding process. But it's going to take a lot of effort of every stakeholder, not just the political leaders, but professionals, citizens, media, all of us. So cautiously optimistic.
Chayu or Asanga? If not, there are two questions from the audience, which we can kind of touch on in the last 2 minutes or so. Which would you prefer?
I'm happy to take an audience question if that covers more.
All right.
I broadly agree with Bhavani's take on the next 6 months, cautiously optimistic.
I also agree with Bhavani.
All right, so we'll package these two questions together. What is the public perception of China, and how much will perceived deal-making or relations with China affect public support for the new government? And to touch on what Bhavani just said, when should we expect the Rajapaksas to return? It's a wonder they came back at all, but does anyone think they will be brought back to Sri Lanka to face justice, or will their assets be seized to help the country? And we'll end after that.
Can I quickly come in on the Rajapaksas? You never know. I mean, anything's possible in Sri Lanka. I'll keep it very brief. Anything's possible, but it's only one Rajapaksa who's left the country. The others are in Sri Lanka, and there are already cases filed where they can't travel outside. So what's important is that the justice process takes its course. Any allegations are investigated and prosecuted. But as we've seen in the past as well, there are problems in Sri Lanka. So there is a possibility there could be international avenues look for justice. We'll have to see, but it's only one Rajapaksa who's out of the country right now.
And Asanga, do you want to finish on public perception of China and how that may affect support for the government?
Basically, yes, I think they would need to, the new regime would need to have sort of more transparency in the Chinese news. The people would like to see what's on the 99-year agreement. I have seen it. I have seen even the oil tank agreement, which was signed with India. That's also confidential. I have read that as the Director General. I had eyes on it, but then we could have done it better. All these deals, because I think the public, discussion with, as well as it requires, Sri Lanka requires that transparency. So I think the China factor, whatever that has happened, we can't undo the agreements that were signed. The agreements that I have seen is a continuation. For example, the 99-year lease is for continuation for another 50 years, or it doesn't stop. So no regime can sort of, I don't think investigating on Chinese projects is possible for any regime that's coming forward, unless they take a very strong position, basically on corruption, on having independent institutions. What Bhavani mentioned, on accountability is a serious issue because the protesters were asking for, their looted money back. But why is only a British parliamentarian speaking about an international arrest warrant? Not a single Sri Lankan parliament member is speaking about an international arrest warrant for the Rajapaksas. So if these basically mechanisms or the toolkit is not on the accountability as well as other sort of areas where the protesters were fighting for was not addressed, I think the Rajapaksas again could come back. And Sri Lanka, the security situation is also very sensitive, because Easter Sunday bombing was a clear example. That is the only factor that Rajapaksas could come back to power. So bombs and elections, again, in South Asia, you see some serious connections for bombs and elections. I have, done a sort of a paper on that. So the security sensitivity as well as, balancing the China factor are very important areas.
And on that note, I just wanted to thank everyone for tuning in, but also thank you to our fantastic panelists for what was a fantastic discussion. Tomorrow is going to be a very consequential day for Sri Lanka, so we will stay tuned and have more analysis for you soon. Thanks, everyone, and take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Akhil.